My name's Kevin Kinker. I'm the CEO of Kinker Consulting, and I've been in recruiting for the past 23 years.
I'm Natasha Kahimkar, CEO of Melita Advisors, and I've been in people talent in DEIB for over 25 years.
I'm Michael Case, and after 20 years, I've accepted that I'm a recruiter, and I will always be a recruiter.
I'm Matthew Caldwell, CEO of Rocket Power, and I've been in the recruiting world for over 25 years.
All right.
Sure. Yeah.
We all ready?
All right. Well, welcome back. This session is going to be something that is just ebbed and flowed, like everything that we've seen in the market the last 2-3 years. And I think it's more critical to talk about it right now than ever because it seems to be getting lost in the shuffle, and that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So, really just leading off, what are you seeing in the market today? Like now that it's we're always just talking about recession. What's actually happening now?
In this world, in that area, I think it's interesting. We see, I felt like for a while, earlier, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, leaders in companies would talk about it almost because they felt like they had to, or like it was checking a box. And I do feel like maybe the last 2 or 3 years, it became genuine and real that companies were thinking about it. But I'm a little worried about some of the things I've seen recently where as things get tighter, as budgets get tighter, companies start thinking about their spend and their runway and all these types of things, especially in the startup world that we work in. Like when you think about it from a recruiting perspective, actually putting an effort forth to try and go create a diverse pipeline of candidates to help hire diverse individuals, it has to be a completely different initiative. You can't approach it the same way you approach your normal traditional recruiting methods, and there has to be an extra investment financially. It just comes down to you have to spend the money on different initiatives, different outreach tactics, different interview tactics, different teams. And when things get tight, it seems like oftentimes that's one of the things that it's like one of the first things that they cut. Or they say, oh, well, we still want the diversity, but this team here that's doing all this other work, can they just spend 30% of their time and fill the funnel with 30% of the candidates? And so I'm a little worried with what we're going to see during this time period, especially in the startup world, that might not actually be a focus, at least from the recruiting side of it, for a while, until the budgets turn around, until people feel comfortable that they're going to have the ability to go get more money and continue to grow. I think that's my initial thought about the current state of things.
It's interesting. I also agree that the thinking has evolved on it, and that CEOs and boards of startups do realize that it's important. But I don't know if building on that, I don't know if they really put their money where their mouth is or where their belief is. And what I see is, if you look at exec teams of startups, it's mostly male. And then when they finally get around to hiring their first head of HR, they insist it should be a female. So they'll have diversity, which is the world's biggest cop-out, right? Like, that would be interesting if it was the head of product or the head of eng, but no, it's the head of HR. And then when that person joins, they're like, okay, now this is your responsibility. Go figure it out. And you're not gonna have any budget. That's sort of the experience that I've seen the last few years. I may just be jaded, but that's what I've seen.
It's been interesting. The focus on the D part of DEIB is still very, very strong, right? So companies, when they start to look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, focus on representation first. And they typically look to talent acquisition to address that. The gap that I see most significantly is that companies rarely want to get into equity. But the big challenge is the willingness to participate in inclusion and belonging to make that happen. So you bring in all these great folks, and then you do nothing to make them want to stay. And that sort of continuity of focus on DEIB is still not as prevalent as I think we would all like it to be. It also means, so Michael, to your point, that you can't make diversity all about recruiting. Where's the rest of the story? The inclusion and belonging doesn't come from an HR function or people and talent function or even a chief diversity officer. It comes from the day-to-day interactions with a team and with someone's manager. So the opportunity that we have is to not ask our talent acquisition leaders or our HR leaders or our chief diversity officers to be responsible for the representation, because the representation isn't just about bringing people in the door, it's keeping them. It's not just keeping them, but it's helping people grow and having people excel in an organization and feel that they have opportunity to grow. That's the part that's often forgotten. I'm really excited, though, that I'm seeing a lot more executive teams wanting to understand DEIB and the role that they can play. So a learning journey is how we describe it, because you're never really done. So the way I describe DEIB to execs and to anyone is it's like an ultra marathon, but the course changes, the weather changes unexpectedly, and there isn't a finish line. And I tell that story not to make people feel disheartened or not to make people upset or oh my goodness, what are we stepping into here? But it's more to understand that there are so many factors that come into play when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. These are big words, each of which have their own, it's a whole field of study in each one of them. So to think that we're going to come in, do some training, or change the performance management system or the recruitment process, and we're done, it's not even remotely reasonable. It is a journey, because sometimes you might be able to do things on your own. Sometimes you may need somebody to come in and help you accelerate. Sometimes you're going to get things wrong, right? The language we use changes. So this idea of it being a journey, and to recognize that we're all going to be on the journey together, and sometimes I'm going to have a rough time or I'm going to make a mistake, and you're going to step in and help me out that time. And in another time, you may have a challenge, and I'll be able to step in and help you stay strong too. But that we're constantly learning, we're constantly growing, and that it belongs to all of us. So I actually stay away from the debate of where should the diversity role report, because in the end, that's not the important question. The important question is, how invested are we all in DEIB, and how are we approaching it?
Where? You included in the last few things you said, and where brings me to remote. I don't think there'll be any argument here that inclusion and belonging was a problem before the pandemic hit. I think all of us were saying it. We've had many times where we sidebar, we have coffee or whatever, and lamented the fact that we had the ability to bring people in, as you were saying, but the inability to keep them. Now all of a sudden we're in a remote world. And probably at best it'll be a hybrid. It has completely changed. How do you do it now? How do you make it? Is inclusion and belonging getting better because now we sit in Zoom windows? Is it getting worse? What does that look like now?
The where question is something I thought about for a long time, because I worked abroad for the first 15 years of my career, and diversity and inclusion and belonging, they all felt or meant different things. I was in Japan for the most part, but also covering Asia, and later on I worked in Latin America as well. And so all these definitions are just different in these places, but the belonging was always an issue. We were always in a remote office. So headquarters was one way and had lots of resources and kind of the in crowd and the cool kids, and we were, half the day or in a different time, in a completely different time of day, so that the headquarters was sleeping and we were working, or vice versa. I think with the U.S. going remote and open remote locations, and also just generally companies moving out of the Bay Area and exploring more locations, we're seeing and being reminded that the U.S. has a lot of cultures that are often regionally influenced as well. And that's a whole different paradigm to be working with. I had one client, for example, where their San Francisco office were like, no one ever wants to come back to the office. But they had an Indiana office, and everyone's like, when can we get back to the office? Because, if you have a 5,000 square foot home, you just have no place to work, right? So, unlike here in the city. And it was something they had to navigate. So I think it opens up a whole, the shifting nature of work now opens up a whole host of avenues that also have to be considered, which is where I think traditionally we're thinking about just diversity, right? As Natasha mentioned, now it's even more complex. I don't have the answers to it, but I think it's things that need to be thought about.
That remote question and hybrid, build inclusion because now all of a sudden collectively the employees are saying we're in this together. So it's almost like an inadvertent way of making us all feel belong, a common thread, if you will. So I don't know, Natasha, what are your thoughts on the remote world around this?
I think hybrid and remote opens up a door to bring in more representation. At the same time, I think we have this belief that the technology that we use because we're remote, so whatever your video conferencing technology is, that it solves for inclusion and it solves for belonging, but there are no shortcuts with management. And I think people say, oh, well, I'm on Zoom and everybody's the same equal size box, so it's okay. But the reality is we're still not taking into account how do we draw out the people who may not naturally participate or may not naturally contribute early in a conversation? Who's talking more? Whose opinion carries more weight? These are not things that technology is going to solve. These are not things that remote or hybrid will solve either. It still requires managers to be great managers. It still requires team members to pay attention to the dynamics in their team so that we are welcoming in and inviting in different perspectives. Depending, maybe people are coming from a different industry. I'm not talking about just the traditional, when we think about diversity, about people of color, gender, race and ethnicity, or veteran status. I'm getting beyond that technology isn't going to solve for some of the core challenges we have with inclusion and belonging. Those are about behaviors. They're about our behaviors, and technology isn't going to fix that.
I actually am a little concerned about it with the remote nature, because a lot of people, the only time they are around individuals that were diverse from them is when they were in the office, when they would go to the city, when they go around where they work. When they go back home, they're around those people that they have been around, that they're comfortable with, that they know. And the times that they get outside of that comfort zone is oftentimes when they leave their neighborhood, when they leave that little area that they spend time with and those people that they're around. And there could be diversity in their neighborhood, but it's limited. What I worry about is, we also see this with people in general in society with what's gone on the last couple of years of being at home. A lot of people become very, they've become a little bit more focused around a smaller circumference of political, social ideologies of all sorts, because they're in their smaller bubbles and they're in their smaller circle, and they don't get exposed to other individuals and other opinions and other perspectives on things, because they don't have to. Because I can just go to my Facebook group that I like, or my this, that I like, and I can just talk to these people I like, and I don't ever have to get on a train and be around all these other people, and walk through the city and be around all these other people, and go to an office and be around all these other people. And in those situations where we have to learn to interact with all these other people in a normal, natural way, has gone away when I'm at home. And so I actually am concerned about that. It could put a pause on the progress we've been making around that, because people are in their bubbles. They're at home. I mean, they're relocating to Montana or wherever, all these little areas, and even more remote, because now on these big ranches and they're not around people. They have chosen, a lot of people have chosen to move to these areas where it's even less diverse than where they were before. And so I wonder about the long-term impact of that, of the remote culture on inclusion and belonging. You might still be able to hire people that are very diverse, but will it be genuine inclusion, belonging in the culture? If I only have to interact with you on Zoom, but I don't have to sit next to you and eat next to you and be in rooms where we're like discussing things, and I have to be forced to see you as a human and respect your opinion and just get past all these biases that are out there. I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah. Well, let's put a pin in that one for now. I'd be curious to see, maybe we come back in like a year and see what happened, because I think it's very much a developing situation. Let's start talking about compensation and equity, as you were starting to bring up before. Now we're spread out throughout the country. There's the questions around jobs needing specific skill sets, looking for specific results. but the thought of you live in a market where you don't get paid as much is starting to be challenged. There's a lot to do with equity in that because of where location is. Have we gained any ground there? Are we doing better? What does that look like?
I don't know if you guys saw that article that just came out.
Aki Ito's
There's the one about
Business Insider.
Yeah, I can't remember actually. I didn't see who wrote it, but I was looking at the stats around the FANGs, and their compensation has just dropped off the table. Some companies are paying I think Netflix is year over year for the same role, same skill set level, and all that is 68% lower compensation for offers going out now versus a year ago.
Wow.
Meta is like 52% of what it was. I mean, all the big FANGs have dropped their compensation dramatically for software engineers, for knowledge workers, which are always the ones that got paid the most. And I don't know if that's because they're saying, hey, if you're going to work remote and I'm not having to give you blue bottle coffee and lunch and all these other things, I'm not paying you as much because you're staying at home. I don't know what it is, but it's interesting what's happening right now around compensation for sure.
And you think all those perks would lead them to making more money because now they're not taking advantage of it.
I don't know. It's just and I would love to see how that looks in a year from now as Apple and others say you have to come back to work a couple days a week, if that might change it. But it's a very interesting stat that was released. And it was like a week ago or a couple days ago that article came out. I don't know if you guys all saw it, but it was powerful data.
Well, that sort of points again to that shift of where the power is in the labor relationship right now. That has kind of flipped almost overnight from a few years of employees really being in charge and being able to chart their own course to now the employers are coming back with the power of their own, I guess.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that in comp. I think we're seeing that in the return to office situation. We're seeing that in the you are all not working hard enough speeches that have been coming out, right? So it's interesting how fast that change happened, and then wondering when it will shift back the other way too.
Well, and I wonder too, for underrepresented groups, how compensation has shifted. So if you isolate underrepresented groups and their compensation last year versus this year, what the delta is there. I'm curious about that. From a pay equity perspective, when companies do pay equity analyses, which many companies are very reluctant to do, often it's not as expensive a shift to make to address any issues that they do identify. But the fear that it could cost millions and millions of dollars stops companies from taking that one little step of working with an organization that is experienced in doing this and doing a full analysis and identifying where they have hotspots, where they have issues to address. There are a lot more organizations that will work on that for you now. So the capability is certainly there. I still am not sure how much companies are taking that into consideration when they think about their salary budgets, comp budgets. I do know some organizations right now, just comp in general, are allowing promotions but not allowing compensation adjustments for the time being. So that makes it really complicated in terms of retention as well, that you're getting the recognition, sort of.
So that's so short-sighted. I mean, we've dealt with that internally when we were internal. The last company I was at, when I was internal, dealt with that, where we see spikes in compensation for certain roles, and people that were hired 6 months ago are getting paid way less than the people who are getting hired today, and they're worried about like bringing them up to level, but it's super short-sighted because all that means is that those people are going to leave because they're not getting paid what they should be getting paid,
and you're going to replace them.
They're going to have to replace them. They're going to just cost the same amount, and they're going to lose productivity during that delta and that gap. Mm-hmm. So it's a very short-sighted approach when companies take that approach, and I don't know how to get them to understand that, and separate to show them data. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely not a very good way to address those compensation gaps.
Yeah.
Let's focus a little bit more on how do we get our company to focus more on DEIB? How does that work? If you're a people leader, if you're someone within the company that really wants to guide change, we have a lot of experience here. How do you make that happen?
I worked with one engineering leader who joined sort of midstream in my tenure at a company, and he was white male, but he was just so into doing the right thing around DEIB that he led it from his standpoint. And we talked in another session about who has the sort of power in an org to make change, and it's not the HR team, frankly. Unfortunately, they're not the ones. They can provide some guidance and a roadway and a roadmap, but in a tech company, the engineering leader is usually the most powerful person outside the CEO, and this person was so committed to it and just was able to drive things. So I think it takes a leader to do it, and I think if you don't have leaders that are behind it, it's very hard for anyone else to make a difference.
Yeah, I think if you can identify someone who can be an ally in the organization, who has that passion, it's a multi-pronged approach. Diversity, you have to get the diverse candidates in the top of the funnel. You have to get them in there so they're having the conversation, so they're on the interview slates, so that you actually can make offers to these individuals. And then the equity, inclusion, belonging, kind of to what you talked about, that is all after that. Individuals like that are allies, that are passionate about it, or diverse themselves, that are going to be very passionate about it. Invest time. If you're in a recruiting leadership role like us, or HR leadership role, invest time with those people and try and get the other leaders in the organization, usually the CEO, to give them what they need. And it comes down to writing a check. I mean, it really comes down to writing a check, because there's an investment. There's going to be people investment. There's going to be training investment. There's going to be all sorts of things that they have to do. But it also is support. Like if you can get the CEO to verbalize that support, to talk about it in the organization, to support this leader that's doing this, and then show the success of that team, not just on the number of people on the team that are diverse, but how they're doing. And if you look at really high-performing teams, they don't all look at every single problem the same way. The great thing about diversity is all of our backgrounds make us think about things differently. And when you think about things differently and you're on the same team and you look at a problem, you got every perspective there to try and solve the problem, and generally you come to a better solution on that problem. And so if you can find an individual like that, see the long-term benefits of that team's performance based off of the fact they've got a very diverse team that's working on these problems and creating great outcomes, and then the leader of the organization is then vocalizing it and sharing it and supporting them and propping them up. Those people that are maybe a little resistant to it will, at least for self-preservation, realize that they need to think about it, because their teams need to be able to perform at the same level as this other individual.
I'm a big advocate for getting executive teams to think very holistically about their roles. In our organization, we talk about inclusive leadership is leadership. The model of leadership that we've been working with for so many years, it's not holistic enough. We're asking different things of our leaders now. For a head of people, for example, to be the one who's pushing the DEIB train, that I think requires a lot of patience and really strong influencing skills. I will add to that with diversity, there's so many benefits, right? McKinsey showed studies where innovation, decision-making, revenue can improve dramatically with great representation in your organization. What those studies don't address is what happens in between, and that's conflict, right? We get great perspectives. All these different perspectives coming in means we have different opinions. Different opinions means you will have conflict. Making it healthy conflict, and for a people leader to focus their energies on teaching and embedding skills on how to really engage in healthy conflict that's resolved, so not conflict that sort of hangs out forever, but raising and resolving conflict, that is the key. And so to the extent that a people leader can really help functional leads understand the benefit of DEIB, right? You've got the studies, the data are out there. I would also suggest not necessarily approaching this from a social justice perspective, right? I think often I'm hearing a turnoff for leaders is that HR is coming and it's bleeding heart, and it's not that people are uncaring. I don't mean to say that at all, but there is a business benefit to diversity. there is a business benefit to having inclusion and belonging alive in your organization. But the key to harnessing that is really an ability to navigate conflict. And that's where I think the people functions, we get impatient, right? We want everybody to, why can't you just understand? People understand. But if Michael has to hire 50 salespeople, or he can't get the product out the door, what's the trade-off he's going to have to make with those 50 hires that he needs to make in a month, right? Who's going to take some of the pressure off to make sure that he's still going to hit his targets? He's still going to get everybody into the onboarding class at the right time, while also casting a wider net, knowing that it's going to take time. So saying that DEIB matters is one thing, but getting into the challenges that a leader is dealing with on a day-to-day basis, that's where things really start to, the rubber hits the road, right? That's where we really can have impact as people leaders.
You brought up something interesting, and this is going to be a tough question. Probably maybe should have prompted this before we even met, but it just came through now. A lot of times we're all preaching about the advantages of this. We've all seen it, but a lot of times no one's talking about it. So please humor me. Can you talk about a company you've worked with or a client where you've implemented a program that not only hired people, but you got the belonging and inclusion correct, and the result that came with it? And I think this is really good for founders who, like you said, HR or someone else is pushing it on them. They don't understand the power of it. Let's talk to them about the power of it.
The work I do is, we don't really do a lot of the equity, inclusion, belonging after hire. We're all about helping companies hire. They don't really lean on us for post-hire. That's when we bring in Natasha and others that know how to help them with that. But I can think of a client, I think some of you guys know Greg Russell. He was at SnapDocs. We were there helping them hire a bunch of engineers. And we actually got, early on they talked about the fact that they wanted to have a diverse slate of candidates on the engineering side. And this is at the heart of hypergrowth in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and it's super difficult. Greg was really, really pushing for it. And when we first got in there, there was conversation, but there was not the investment necessary, because we talked about, look, and Greg knew this, but I think other people in the organization hadn't quite wrapped their head around the fact you're going to have to look, all of the metrics and the KPIs that we build out around recruiting, you're going to have less candidates coming through each week. You're going to have less interviews coming through each week. You're going to have to think about the way you assess these individuals. If you're looking at a senior software engineer and minimum threshold is 8 years, maybe you need to drop that down to 5 years for these individuals because they just haven't been in the industry as long. Can you think about some of these other skills they're bringing to the table besides just that can help with being able to be effective, being a good hire on the engineering side? And so about 2-3 months in, we actually basically created a specific team, and all they did was go after top of funnel for diverse candidates. And the goal was to try and get, I think it was a third of the candidates that got to interview stage be diverse. And we were very successful at getting them to that point. And it was the project overall, they wanted to hire 80 engineers. We thought it would take about 8 months. And they wanted to have a decent amount that were going to be, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was right around 20% ended up being diverse. We got that whole project done in 6 months. So got it done quicker, which saved the company money because they pay us by the month. Yeah. So they paid less amount of money to us to get the job done, and they were able to hire diverse candidates because of it. And so if you have that focus, and if you have if organizations can recognize the need to do that, it can have a good outcome on the hiring side. And that's the only part of the process that I touch currently. I'm no longer running HR, so that's an example I can think of.
Nice.
I moved from one company to another once, and it was pretty clear right away that the new company just seemed more diverse, both in the conversations I had with people and in just representation as well. And there was someone within the HR team who she was a culture carrier for that company. She'd been like employee number 7 or something, and there was like 1,000 or something like that by that point. And she said that they'd worked for a long time on the inclusion piece first. Before, they never had any like diversity hiring goals or programs, but they worked on the inclusion. And because of that, it just became a magnet of everyone feeling comfortable with who they were. And I was pretty impressed with that. And it was pretty clear from as soon as I joined that it was different.
Ultimately, what was the business results? As Matt said, they saved time. They were working on building things faster, which, gosh, in the startup world, is so critical. What do you see was the business result that really helped them by having that focus on inclusion?
This was a consumer company, so one thing that was super clear is we looked a lot more like our customers.
Oh, nice.
And so we're making products that made more sense for our customers. And that I could only imagine, I mean, it's a very hard thing to measure, but I could only imagine that was super useful in relating to business results.
Driving revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. How about you, Natasha?
Coming in from the inclusion and belonging side, the teams that we've seen that have implemented this focus on how to navigate conflict, how to align as a team, what's the common purpose, figuring out how they're going to work together, their team agreements, investing in that upfront has shortened product to market time by half, which is pretty remarkable. Again, consumer products. But that shift of we know we're going to hit roadblocks and we know we're going to hit obstacles along the way, but we know how to navigate it. That's where the real emphasis was. Now, they had brought together a very diverse team, a globally diverse team. So we had multiple nationalities, different genders. There are multiple dimensions of diversity represented in this group. But it was that focus that people tried to then replicate. They wanted to replicate. They would point to that team and say, hey, that works really differently. It looks different. They act different. Everything's different about that team. And it's not because of the optics. It's not just the visual that's different. There's something else in the way these folks work together that is different. And so other teams started to ask for that as well. I think it's really the harnessing the capabilities that people bring and looking ahead and figuring out how we're going to go through conflict. Learning that has been key. Ultimately, the big focus from our perspective is it's not just about awareness. It's not just about training. A workshop is not going to make everything better. It really is about making sure that there are systems and processes in place to prop up the way people think and the intention people have when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because we want things that are going to outlast us, right? So if I win the lottery and I'm off to some exotic locale next and I drop everything at work, I want the organization to still have the core tenets of DEIB embedded in a way that's not dependent on me as an individual. And so this is the one thing I will say as a people leader when I was in-house, I often would just introduce elements of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into the company and never say anything about it. Never said anything about it. And it was deliberate, often because the leaders didn't want to hear it in an explicit way. And so it's the long game in terms of influencing and getting people on board. But in the meantime, in parallel, I am sitting there and I'm introducing competencies for selection and for assessment so that there's a little bit more objectivity brought into some of our core processes of hiring and performance. That I'm looking at our handbook. Well, who needs to know about the handbook? Maybe your GC and maybe other parts of the organization. But are they really paying attention to the fact that I've put in gender inclusive language? I usually would tell them afterwards. These things last even after I'm gone. And that's what I'd love to see from our people leaders and even our executive teams, that they start to think about what's the legacy that I want to leave behind and what's necessary to make that come to life.
Interesting. So you just organically did it. I think that's a really good tip. I've never heard anyone say that before, of organically bringing it in, not forcing it, and next thing you know, it's there. And then maybe for business leaders understanding you might have a diverse team that's successful, you can look at the business result right in front of you. You just maybe didn't realize it was there. So
I'll tell you one thing that won't work. One thing that absolutely will not work is approaching DEIB from a place of blame and shame.
Yeah. Right?
We may feel a bit of an adrenaline rush, and we may feel good when we've sort of put people in their place when it comes to diversity and how they're talking or what. How open are you when somebody puts you in your place? How willing are you to look at different perspectives when someone's told you you're wrong? I'm not saying there aren't moments where we shouldn't have those conversations. We should. Those conversations can be really important. They can be very eye-opening for people. But leading with that will absolutely shut down any openness. And so it's a one thing, a do not do, don't lead with blame and shame.
Can't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is all the time we have today. So, Unfiltered, stay classy. We'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.